Welcome back to the Free Titan. Today I'm going to continue the series of talks on the planets and their mythological counterparts in Greek, especially in Greek mythology. Continuing today with Jupiter and his mythological incarnation as Zeus. So a sort of astrological overview of Jupiter would reveal that this planet rules basically everything that is expansive and enjoyable in life. So Jupiter loves partying, having a good time. He certainly rules the second chakra, which is procreation, and the sexual organs are related to Jupiter for sure. Financial abundance in different forms is connected to Jupiter without a doubt. And when you see a prominent Jupiter in a chart, it's often an indication of financial expansiveness and abundance. And similarly with Saturn, a lot of times a very prominent Saturn can block those qualities. It can block fertility, abundance, things like that. Obviously, like Saturn, Jupiter has negative qualities. Jupiter can be so expansive that he sort of overextends himself, uses up all of his energy, lets other people get a hold of his energy. He's not very good with boundaries because he's the planet of expansiveness. And so that's one of the primary drawbacks with Jupiter is he can be prone to excesses in terms of indulgence, sex, spending money. He can maybe invest so much money and leverage himself so much that he invites his own ruin. Jupiter's not very good at consolidating gains in his life, in his personal life, or in his business endeavors. So as in all things, we're looking for balance. So for Jupiter to operate at an optimal level, he needs a strong Saturn as well. He needs that voice of restraint, discipline, budgeting, guarding one's energy from other people or bad situations. These are all the sort of province of Saturn. And so when Saturn is healthy, it really creates a better environment for Jupiter to be healthy as well. And these are sort of basic traits of Jupiter that you could find in any astrology book. Jupiter also rules religion, morality, and political institutions. And we'll circle back to that a little bit. But I think in terms of understanding Jupiter and Zeus, we also have to understand Saturn and Kronos. And so there is a big tension here because usually when one is present to a strong degree, it resists the existence of the other because they're sort of paradoxical in their coexistence because they're opposites. So if you have expansivity and you enjoy life, you usually don't want to restrain yourself. You usually will go to an excess and you'll sort of expend yourself on enjoyments, partying, pleasure, spending money, and this is people with strong Jupiterian energy have a tendency to do this. They also usually have large bodies. So it's like you can imagine a sort of, person with a larger body, red face, drinking all night, partying, going to excess. She's a very lovable figure. Probably has a lot of romantic interests simply because they have this aura of abundance and giving and generosity and joy about life. And then Saturn, on the other hand, when you see someone who has strong Saturnian qualities, they're more sort of, prudishness could be a part of it, but it's more about self-restraint, like in terms of resources and energy. It's more about a desire to discipline oneself, to hold oneself back from situations that might be unhealthy, for example, or you want to avoid situations where people are prone to excess. And so it's like they're in a way polar opposites. One is expensivity, one is being contracting or contractive. One likes to spend, one likes to budget. In terms of political sort of ideology or systems, Jupiter likes order, interestingly enough. So that might seem like a change from his sort of traits as a partier, someone who's prone to excess. But in a political system, because he also rules sort of like philosophies and moralities, he like in Greek mythology, he rules Mount Olympus, and so he's the one that keeps everyone else in check. So when we look, so to sort of unravel these paradoxes and to understand them more intuitively, we can look to Greek mythology. So Greek mythology is full of examples of Zeus's romantic endeavors, and this speaks to the characteristics of Jupiter as a sort of personality or an energy that likes to enjoy oneself, right? And to procreate, to replicate oneself in the world through one's children or through one's businesses. So this aspect of Zeus is well known and well documented. But he's also the governor, let's say, of Mount Olympus. He's also the chief political figure on planet Earth in Greek mythology. So reading from this this book on Greek mythology, it says, the regime of Zeus is marked by order, and essentially under his rule the world is stable. And when we go back to, I already did a talk on Saturn, when we look at the Titans and Saturn, there is that line about the golden age being ruled by Saturn, but generally speaking in the modern world, because that was in the golden age, so our paradigm and reality is different now, but in the modern world, and this was even extending this to the world that the Greeks understood, like during the time of the golden age of Athens and Pericles and Socrates. This is still sort of the modern world in terms of Greek mythology. Certainly the Romans lived in the modern world in terms of Greek mythology. But in this sort of modern order, Saturn would be represented as a sort of enemy, as a bringer of chaos and pain. Now, this chaos and pain is eternal, and I think the modern world is largely defined by how we define ourselves in opposition to this pain and suffering. And one of my theories is that in Greek mythology, the Golden Age was ruled by Saturn because in the Golden Age, people accepted their responsibilities and their burdens in life, which is the province of Saturn. And people took on more responsibilities. They faced pain as a necessary part of life, not as an evil to be avoided. And so when you look at this sort of paradigm, which I think existed even in Roman times, is true today, where pain is something to be medicated for. We're supposed to take painkillers if we have pain. A lot of medicine is pathological, so they treat the symptoms of sicknesses rather than the root cause, which is making your immune system weak. So how would we say, holistic medicine is focused more on dealing with strengthening the organism as a whole, right? Through exercise, through right diet. The pathological paradigm of modern medicine is much more focused on just medicating people to treat their symptoms, but oftentimes it can make the root cause even worse. Like if you're drinking a lot and you're just taking medication to lower your blood pressure, but you're continuing to drink, you're continuing to erode the health of the organism, the human organism, your biological organism. So I think that, in a golden age, if everyone, for example, really respected their own spiritual necessity of growing and disciplining themselves, you wouldn't need such strong political institutions, for example, right? We wouldn't need to put so much money into law enforcement or maintaining law and order, because if everyone was moral and well-behaved and disciplined themselves, the necessity for this Jupiterian political institution is much diminished. And that's why I think that in the really, really ancient times, at least in Greek mythology, Hesiod talks about how in the Golden Age, Saturn ruled Mount Olympus, right? Kronos, who is Saturn, ruled Mount Olympus. So actually the fact that we need these political institutions, which are Jupiterian institutions, shows us that collectively our consciousness has actually dropped to need this. But this is our reality now. So to say, well, we don't, if we just pretend people are angels, then we won't need all these strict law enforcement measures. We won't need political institutions. This is just wishful thinking. It's not reality. And maybe this golden age never existed, but the fact that mythologically it's referenced to helps us to contextualize the role of Jupiter and Saturn. And so the need for political institution arises when human beings are behaving in a less than ideal way. I think this is pretty easy to understand. However, this is our reality, that human beings can behave rather poorly without strong political institutions and law enforcement, and this has been true for thousands of years. So anyway, and this is where Jupiter comes into the situation. So the will of Zeus, who is Jupiter, is that the world should continue as a stable entity, just as no single, and then it goes on to talk about how if we go into excess in any one of the other gods' provinces and qualities, the world sort of devolves into a less than ideal state. And so they go on to say, just as no single one of the natural elements of earth, water, fire, and air prevails, so the power of no one deity cannot usurp pride of place. Each of the gods is on his or her own invincible. If Aphrodite prevailed, the world would be nothing but copulating couples, so love-making couples. If Ares prevailed, the madness of war would be all that we know. So if Aphrodite, who is Venus, was the only power in the world, you would just have lovemaking, and you wouldn't have people, maintaining law and order. You wouldn't have people working to create wealth and food so that people could eat, right? Obviously, it would be a very out of balance world. Similarly, if Ares, who is Mars, prevailed, the madness of war would be all that we would know. So if Mars was the predominant deity, unchallenged by Jupiter, unrestrained by Jupiter, then you would have just brawls everywhere, or organized war, or violence, or bloodshed everywhere. And obviously that would not be a healthy system or world order either. So these are obvious things, but they're speaking to the importance of law and order and Zeus, these Jupiterian qualities. And obviously, like in this modern context of our 21st century world, and even going back much further, this is maintained through political institutions, right? Like we don't have to believe in some deity in the sky just maintaining law and order. This is a myth. But what it does is it speaks to the truth of this sort of different aspects of our world that keep everything functioning in a healthy way, right? Like we need Venusian love, we need Martian power, but we need a deity to keep all of these things in check, which is Jupiter, which is Zeus. Jupiter rules by wisdom, but he brooks no disagreement, etc., etc. So this is kind of the background for Jupiter and how he exists in a mythological system. And so as an aside, I think, when we think of this mythologically, when we think of astrology and planetary archetypes mythologically, it really helps us connect to it intuitively. And then when we can also project that onto the world we live in today, we can really understand it as well. And so for me, I like to come back to this idea of Saturn, because anytime I talk about Jupiter, I want to talk about Saturn. Every time I talk about Saturn, I want to talk about Jupiter. They're really like a yoked couple, and we need both of them. But I think that, it behooves us to talk more about the personal responsibility of each individual spiritually to better themselves and to restrain themselves. Because the worse our relationship is with Saturn, the more we rely on Jupiter, at least in a macro sense. Let me explain what I mean. The less each individual takes on their personal responsibility to discipline oneself, to be the best person they can be, to behave in a moral way in society. And by moral, I simply mean to treat other people's person and property with respect, because this is the ultimate goal of political institutions and law enforcement as well. When we live in a free society, the basic tenet of all of this is to give people a system in which freedom can exist, but where you're not harming other people or their property. This is the basic sort of liberal idea behind democracy and republican governments. But when society itself loses its moral order and individuals lose their ability to restrain themselves, then you place too big of a burden on government and law enforcement, and it sucks up too much of society's resources, and society starts to devolve again into chaos, which is Saturn. So you see, like, and also, so Jupiter, which are political institutions, is also a religious institutions. So like Christianity is a Jupiterian institution, Hinduism, Buddhism, these are all Jupiterian institutions. And the more sort of organized it is as a political entity, like for example, the Catholic Church is a highly organized political entity, it's much easier to see the role of Jupiter in religion. Saturn, on the other hand, deals more with sort of perceived truth, right? Jupiter has to deal much more with dogmas. So when a church tells you behave like this, or you're going to hell, behave in this particular way because the clergy and the sort of doctrine of the religion says so. This is a very Jupiterian and political idea, because it's not something you're experiencing for yourself. Saturn is the planet of wisdom, usually in astrology, and I really believe it's the planet of wisdom because it's about direct experience of life. So with Saturn, we're dealing with the pain of living, the pain of making mistakes, and the learning from this pain in order to grow in wisdom. So in one of the Greek tragedies, they say wisdom is the child of pain. And I think I've referenced this in the video about Saturn as well. So when people are learning from their own experience, you have less of a need for society to function of dogma. When people are not learning from their own experiences, like you think of medieval times, people were just doing terrible things to each other, and I don't really think a lot of people were taking time to reflect on their mistakes. Like, people weren't praying necessarily or meditating and thinking about how being an outlaw was a bad deal and they should reform themselves. The only thing that really kept society in check in these dark times was religion, saying, hey, if you don't behave, you're going to burn in hell. And so in a medieval context, that sort of really harsh dogma probably was good for society. It probably helped lift up society because people were behaving in such a bad way that you needed to sort of lean into people's fears in order to get them to behave in a better way and to allow society to function. And so in that sense, the religion and the extreme dogmas of Catholicism helped society move in a good direction. Like, you think of, after the Visigoths sacked Rome and Attila the Hun is sowing chaos over most of Europe, it's easy to see that, like, these really harsh Christian doctrines and dogmas probably helped society maintain its structure and its integrity. But now, when we're obviously not in a medieval age anymore, you see this emphasis on, you see people leaving Christian and Catholic dogmas, which are Jupiterian institutions, and turning more towards an inner path. And this is kind of the impetus behind the New Age movement, is saying, hey, I'm tired of living in fear. I'm tired of just being a good person because the church tells me to be a good person. I'm tired of being moral just because the church tells me to be moral. I want to live based on my own experiences. And so with this idea, this New Age idea of going within and sort of learning on your own, there's also a lot of growing pains with this because people tend to go to excess with that, because to have this more Saturnian path, this more solitary individual path, where you're renouncing religious institutions, so this is all very Saturnian, it can create some chaos again in society because most people are not so disciplined as to say, hey, I can deal with this absolute moral freedom and I can actually still behave myself in a reasonable way. If people actually reflected on the consequences of their actions, on the consequences of being, giving into unbridled lust and having God knows how many partners and sort of spreading oneself so thin energetically and not having discipline in their relationships or with their family or how they use drugs or alcohol, if people actually had a clear mind and reflected on the consequences of this whole process of moving into a modern age where we're not so reliant on dogma would go a lot more smoothly. But because people don't reflect necessarily, you have all this chaos where, as a society, we're trying to break free of this Jupiterian dogma, which has controlled Western civilization for 2,000 years. Because I think in pre-Christian times in the Roman Empire, it wasn't so dogmatic. Like, the real rigidity of the Jupiterian Christian Catholic dogmas happened, as Christianity as a religious institution came into place. And I personally think a lot of these religious dogmas didn't have so much to do with the teachings of Christ. It was more the Catholic Church gaining power over people in the medieval age. I think this is a pretty easy point to defend, which is one of the things that created the Protestant Reformation. And so the Protestant Reformation, which happened about 500 years ago, this was where you're changing direction from a Catholic religion where everything was done in Latin, the Bible was in Latin, probably 90+% of the population easily in Europe did not read Latin, so they could not directly read the words of Christ, could not directly read the gospel. And so the clergy, who are largely directed by the religious institution of Catholicism, was interpreting these gospels and the teachings of Christ and the words of Christ in a way that was probably serving the religious institution much more than it was the individual themselves. Oftentimes, not always, certainly. And so when Martin Luther came along from Germany, he was saying, no, we need to translate the Bible into German. We need to translate the Bible into languages that people can actually understand. Now, even then, you had a high level of illiteracy. So even then, most people couldn't read the Bible for themselves once it was translated. But you started opening the door for people to have their own experience of Christianity and for people to start interpreting the words of Christ for themselves. And so this is a more Saturnian take on religion because it's more individual. It's more a path of saying, I'm going to commune with God myself. I'm going to commune with Jesus Christ myself, and I'm going to meditate on his words myself, and I'm going to talk to him myself. I'm going to have a personal relationship with Christ. And I think this is a beautiful movement, and I think Christianity needs to continue in this movement of having people have a personal relationship with God, a personal relationship with Christ. Now, in the U.S., we're a mostly Protestant country, so this is a more natural thing. Yet, you still have some dogmas, obviously, which are holdovers from Catholicism, and the Protestant church has certainly created some of its own dogmas. Like, I think Baptists have certain dogmas that, Lutherans might not share, and et cetera, et cetera. But you start to see how with Protestantism, and most people in the U.S., for example, who just call themselves Christians, they're still sort of following basically a Protestant faith, because that was what split off from Catholicism 500 years ago. But to come back to this sort of the conversation about planetary archetypes, I've talked a lot about how religious and political institutions reflect different aspects of Jupiter and Saturn. And as soon as you start getting into one, you start talking about the other. And so we want some kind of balance, right? So in Greek mythology, we see a great fear of Saturn because Zeus and his brothers locked up Saturn and the other Titans in this great war in ancient times. And what it represents is a certain fear of chaos, a certain fear of individualism, a certain fear of what the individual can do to society if he's not guided by morality. This is what it comes down to. And my point is simply, yes, there's different ways of going away from dogmatic morality. You can have pure anarchy and chaos where people are hedonistic, are just self-indulgent, and this is a sort of Saturnian path as well because it's self-centered. But there's another way of being sort of, let's not call it self-centered, but individualistic about morality and religion, where we're saying, hey, I'm going to try to figure some of these things out on my own, but from a higher moral standing, whereas I'm going to approach what I should do based on the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I'm going to behave in a way from empathy and compassion, saying, hey, I can try to tune into what this other person is experiencing, and I don't have to follow a dogmatic morality in my relationship with this person, in a friendship, in a romantic relationship, in our family, but I'm going to try to feel what they feel and act accordingly. I'm not going to run away from my sensitivity, which is and my empathy, which is ultimately, I think, the bedrock of morality. And the German philosopher Kant said that empathy is the basis of all morality. And so I think my point is there's two directions you can depart from dogma. One is into anarchy, hedonism, and chaos, which is something that should be feared. And this is why the Greeks locked up Saturn. But if we want to move into a new world, a new earth model, you could say in New Age terms, where we have a higher vibration, a higher frequency, a higher degree of experiencing joy and peace, there's also a way of breaking free of dogma and going in a higher way. Dogma kind of keeps us in the middle ground, right? It keeps us in a state of spiritual mediocrity. Jupiterian dogma and institutions and religious institutions and blind adherence to this sort of dogmatic faith keeps us in a state of spiritual mediocrity. Whereas we're not going to be terrible people because we're scared of going to hell, but we're also not going to realize our full potential in God because we're scared of being what God wants us to be as individuals as well, right? We're so locked in this dogmatic way of thinking and behaving that we can also not blossom. So it keeps us from falling, but it also keeps us from blossoming. And I think that there is a place where we can move on from religious dogma and Jupiterian dogma, but to do that, we have to go to a higher moral ground, which is based on direct experience of morality, which is rooted in empathy, which is rooted in wisdom, which is rooted in I'm going to develop my own emotional and moral faculties and act accordingly. I'm going to do unto others what I want them to do unto me. And I want to be more of a mirror of Christ consciousness and God in my own life. And that's different for every person. You can't have one moral system telling everyone how to behave because God has an idea and a vision for each individual and they're in their own spiritual unfoldment and blossoming. But to get there, we have to have time where we can be alone to pray and meditate, where we can develop our own empathetic faculties, our own compassion, so that we can be guided by our own experience of life and our own wisdom, our own ability to digest our own life experience. This is Saturn, to digest our pain and our joy and to reflect on it. And this requires time for reflection. This can be hiking in the woods. This can be meditating. This can be going to church and praying. But this is something that needs to be done in silence, where we can hear our own higher self talking to us. We can hear our own relationship with God informing us about what we've done in life. And when we think about life in this way, it's very liberating, because it's not saying I'm going to fall into hedonism and chaos and I'm going to have 1,000 lovers and just get drunk every night and just do what I want because it feels good in the moment. Because any shred of wisdom tells us that if we go down this path, we're going to be miserable in the long run. We're going to burn up our bridges with our family. We're going to destroy any love we have in our life. We're going to destroy our relationships, and we're going to destroy our health. So just one shred of self-reflection would say, hey, this is not the path. Now, to follow a better path requires more Saturnian qualities, which is discipline and perseverance. So I think that, yes, there's two ways from sort of Jupiterian dogma. And I sort of focused this talk in the end on Jupiterian dogma in a religious sense, but I suppose this is my fascination, is how human beings can evolve, and how as a society we can live in a better and more harmonious state with more prosperity as well, which is the Jupiterian quality. But to do that, we have to go within, develop our own moral and spiritual faculties, and realize that yes, we can sort of deviate from religious and social morality and dogma a bit, but for it to work out, we have to make an effort to go up, and we have to make a supreme effort to reflect on our own experiences. Because if we let go of the moral dogma that has guided our society and our religion for thousands of years, without making even more of an effort to go up, we will fall. And I think we see this a lot. People want to let go of the old ways, of the old moral ways, the dogmas of the Christian church. They want to let go of the dogmas of our political institutions. But I think, unfortunately, many times when people do that, they go down, and they go down quite fast because of overindulgence, lack of discipline, etc. So to do this as a society, we have to realize that we have to make more of an individual effort to go up.